Speakers Committee, and she'll introduce today's featured speaker. Ashley?
Thank you, President Julie. We're honored to have Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams speak to the club today during what is a very busy time for his office. You know, we're in the thick of the election season and everything is very different this year. Maybe you voted, mail-in or early voting. I actually went this morning and was amazed at how easy it was, how quick and easy. The parking lot was a zoo, but inside it was smooth sailing. And there was an energy there that I've never felt before at polling locations. Everybody's just so excited, I think, to do their civic duty. And Secretary Adams has led the charge to make sure we have many options to vote safely and securely during this pandemic. The Secretary is a native of Paducah. He went to public schools and was the first in his family to earn a bachelor's degree. After graduating from the University of Louisville in its third class of McConnell Scholars, the Secretary attended Harvard Law School on low-income aid. Returning to Kentucky, Secretary Adams clerked for Chief U.S. District Judge John Hayburn, for Senator McConnell's 2002 re-election campaign, and as Deputy General Counsel to Governor Ernie Fletcher, before moving to Washington to serve as counsel to the U.S. Deputy Attorney General in the second Bush administration. In 2007, Secretary Adams began full-time private practice in election law, first as general counsel to the Republican Governors Association, and later opening a national practice in the field. He has represented several national political committees, members of Congress, and statewide campaign efforts in all 50 states. Now, because of this unique election experience, Governor Bevin appointed him to the Kentucky State Board of Elections, and in January, he was sworn in as Kentucky's 77th Secretary of State. Please welcome Secretary Michael Adams.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that introduction. Thank you, Julie, for letting me speak to the organization today. Thank all of you for being here. I get asked frequently, what's the biggest concern I've got that keeps me up at night in this election? And believe it or not, it's not vote suppression and it's not vote fraud. It's not even really the pandemic. It's my ability to get information out to the public. It's so hard to do that right now. It's hard for me to travel. It's hard for me to go into a TV studio or speak to a group of people in person. I'm very reliant on Zooms to nonprofit organizations, civic organizations, to help get the word out about how easy it is to vote this year. The silver lining of this pandemic, at least in our elections, is it's never been easier to vote in Kentucky history than it is now, this year, because of changes that we've made. But unless I can convey these options to folks, they won't take advantage of them. So that's my big challenge, and I'm grateful to have this platform today to talk about these things. I want to give you a brief update of what I've been up to in my 9 months or so in office in the Capitol, and of course I'll leave plenty of time for any questions or feedback you have. I ran for this office last year with an overall goal of enhancing Kentuckians' faith in our election process. I found a lot of distrust of our system really across the political spectrum when I ran for this office. I saw it on the left and the right, and there were three specific things I wanted to do to improve public confidence. One is to govern with integrity and not have the sort of scandals that took place in our office before I got here. Number two, I wanted to push a photo ID to vote law, which we did successfully. And third, I wanted to clean up our voter rolls. I said during the campaign that we had 200,000 people on our voter rolls who had moved away or passed away or been put away. And that's not in anyone's interest. So we've actually taken steps on all three of those. I've hired people of the most honorable, sterling personal integrity, and I'm glad that what we're known for today across the country is not turmoil or scandal. It's being the state that's best at running elections. I think of all the things that we're 47th, 48th in our state, we're number one in elections. We had our primary in June. There were a lot of predictions that we'd have vote suppression and vote fraud and so forth, but we actually did the best job of anybody with very high turnout, with no vote fraud. Believe it or not, it's actually pretty unusual for a Kentucky election to have a totally clean election without someone being brought up on charges of vote fraud. And maybe most important, we kept Kentuckians safe, which is really hard to do right now. As proud as I am of that, of Of course, a general election is a different animal entirely. You have 2.5 times the turnout in November that you have in a primary. And so the big challenge for me is how do we take the best of what worked so well in June, preserve that, but also modify it for a general election model. And of course, I also didn't want to forsake my campaign promises. So we've implemented photo ID to vote, but we've done so in a humane way that recognizes that not everyone can get an ID, a photo ID, especially in these times when a lot of government bureaus that issue those have been closed in the pandemic. So we've implemented that, but in a way that's humane. We've withstood various court challenges. We've persuaded everyone that this is going to be done in a way that doesn't disenfranchise anybody. We've also cleaned up our voter rolls. We've taken tens and tens of thousands of dead people off our rolls. Again, it's in no one's interest. It's not a partisan issue to have voter rolls that are correct. Not only do you have a vulnerability to fraud if you have the dead on your voter rolls, but also it makes the lines longer because it just means the rosters are longer that the poll workers have to go through to find your name when you go vote. So it's not in anyone's interest to have voter rolls that are actually in violation of federal and state law. Governor Beshear agrees with me. We've worked together across party lines, and this is one of the things that we've worked together on. So we've seen immense progress toward coming back into legal compliance. But back to November for a moment. Here's what we've changed from June. Number one, we preserved absentee voting for those who need it, whether based on your age or your health condition. It's not for me to play doctor and tell you whether you're too sick or not sick enough to vote absentee. That's your right. It's a subjective right that you have under our laws. But we've made that easier for Kentuckians by launching a portal at govoteky.com. This has various benefits. Number one, it certainly benefits the voter to be able to very quickly and easily have gone online to request an absentee ballot instead of having to wait in line at the clerk's office or call and try to get through their busy phone lines. But also it makes the clerk's life easier to have Frankfurt take on more of that administrative burden. It also makes my job easier in terms of surveilling the election and watching for irregularities. So in real time, I get updates on how many requests are going out and to what addresses, and we can monitor if an address requests multiple ballots and something looks awry there. So the portal has been a really big success. I hope that we can keep it permanently. It's a new program I've presented that I'd like to make permanent if possible, if I have support from the legislature. Another great feature about the portal is if you're voting absentee, you can track your ballot the way you track a UPS package. If you go to govoteky.com, you can punch in your information and see where your ballot is in the process. We have barcodes on all of the ballot envelopes on the way out and on the way back in. And that enables you to check and see where your ballot is in the process. Has your absentee ballot been mailed out to you, and has it been received back by your clerk? And here too, this enables me also to surveil the election from Frankfurt and make sure we don't have lost or stolen ballots. That's really, really a good improvement to our system. I've been voting absentee since 1994 when I moved from Paducah here to Louisville for college, and I wanted to vote back in Paducah. So absentee isn't new to me, but it's actually a pretty new thing to most Kentucky voters. I've been involved in politics professionally or semi-professionally since the early 90s. And like clockwork, every election, 2% vote absentee and 98% of people vote in person on one day in a 12-hour span historically. In this environment, of course, we're going to have way more than 2% absentee. We need a process to make this as smooth as possible. So that's, although absentee voting is certainly an improvement, and I'm glad that we made it more widely available and utilized, our system isn't designed for hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people to vote that way. States that have moved to a primarily mail-based system have taken 5 or 7 years even to get the right machines for that, to train their workers for that. It takes a different infrastructure. And they've also, to break even on money, they've also eliminated a lot of their in-person voting opportunities. Well, I don't have that option under our state laws, nor do I favor it. So what we've tried to do is balance this out. We've actually had fewer absentee ballot requests for our general election than we have for our primary, which is pretty remarkable. Again, with 2.5 times the turnout, we actually have a couple 100,000 fewer absentee ballots requested. So my guess is about 30% of voters will vote absentee, whether they're mailing it back or putting it in the drop box, and 70% will vote in person. So the next big change is making in-person voting easier in two respects. Number one, we wanted to have more locations available for Election Day. And what you've seen in Jefferson County is indicative of what's going on across the state. The governor and I, for the general election, we didn't have this for the primary, but for the general election, each of us had veto power over each county's election plan. And that gave us the leverage essentially to stare down some county clerks that didn't want to open up enough voting locations. So Jefferson County's plan, for example, they only had one location to vote in person in the primary. It worked out okay, but we certainly wanted more locations with a much higher turnout anticipated. So their initial plan was 8. I pushed back on them and we got them up to 20, and they're located all over the county. That's for November 3rd. On November 3rd, we'll have 20 locations to go vote all over the county. That's one way to fix that problem. Here's the other way that I actually favor myself and encourage you to utilize, which is voting before November 3rd. See elections this year as a three-legged stool. If you put too much stress on one leg, you're going to snap it. Absentee voting is a component, roughly a third of the vote. Voting on November 3rd in person, I think that'll be roughly a third of the vote. And then voting in person before November 3rd, I think will be roughly a third of the vote. That's what I'm pushing for. This enables us to stagger out the crowds, not have millions of people slam the polls on one day in a 12-hour span, when we're going to have fewer locations available than we normally would outside of a pandemic. It's been a real challenge to find locations that are willing to let us use them as voting locations. A lot of voting locations are privately held. They've got insurance issues to deal with. They may not be able, under their insurance policies, to let the general public walk around for 12 hours. So we've lost a lot of our private sector locations. We're really relying on schools and fire stations and so forth. And of course, getting poll workers is a challenge. We had a huge drop off in the number of available poll workers in the primary. They just evaporated on us almost overnight. Most of our poll workers are senior citizens. I actually testified to the legislature last year before I was sworn in that we have a poll worker crisis in our state. Our elderly generations that routinely volunteer, over time they're aging out. In my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, we just haven't really stepped up with the same sort of commitment to community. So I've been really beating the drum the last few months to find poll workers. It's not really my job, it's the county clerk's job, but I've tried to be a good partner. So my office has actually recruited just on our own 5,000 plus poll workers. And that's part of the reason you're seeing more locations, not all of them, but more locations open up all across the Commonwealth. So that's one part of the solution, but the other part is to have just more than one election day. It helps us need fewer poll workers and fewer locations. So this past Tuesday, the 13th, we opened up 3 weeks of in-person voting, 3 weeks, 6 days a week of in-person voting. This helps us smooth out the crowds, helps us ensure social distancing. It also really increases the convenience of Kentucky voters. This is what I'm encouraging people to do if they can. If you're able to vote in person, that's great. We encourage you to do that. But if you can do it today, or do it tomorrow, or do it Saturday, or do it 6 days next week, or do it the week after that, that would be really helpful to us at the state level and at the local level in ensuring a safe election that runs smoothly. It's kind of arbitrary. Our laws provide for elections to be all held in one 12-hour span on one day. Those hours and that schedule was designed in the 1800s when we were an agrarian society and before modern times with all the expectations on our schedules. So I'd like to see us make early voting more flexible in the future in any event, but certainly in the midst of a pandemic, a state that has everybody vote on one day is going to have problems. So we're trying to space people out better than that and try to keep a smooth, steady flow over 19 days to vote. That's our special sauce, I think, to making this election go really smoothly. That plus the absentee together, I think, will mean that we have an election day that will go well. So those are my preliminary thoughts. One last point, and I'll turn it over to any questions or feedback. Certainly, people let me know in no uncertain terms they wanted more places to vote, and so we've fixed that. But another thing that people said is we want to know who won the election on election night. I've got some good news and some bad news. I'll give you the bad news first. Outside of our state, I don't think a lot of states will have their votes counted election night. Certainly big states, swing states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, as a matter of policy, they don't start they don't even start processing absentee ballots until the polls close. And unlike us, most of their votes are going to be cast absentee. We're going to be unusual in that we have most of our voters voting in person over a period of time, but those states are different. So what that means is I don't think we're going to know for a couple of weeks who the president's going to be. That's if the race is close. If it's not close either way, then maybe we'll know sooner. But I think that it might take 2 weeks to have that information. It's going to be pretty tough, I think, for our country. But here in Kentucky, and this is the good news, we're not going to wait that long. We've made a couple of changes that mean we're going to have a much faster count than other states. Number one, because most of our voters are voting in person, we're going to have all those totals on election night. Those are much easier to count and process than absentees because we just push a button on the machine and there's our numbers. Historically, Kentucky is one of the first states in America to have their numbers counted on election night, and that'll be the case here. If 70% of your votes are in person, you've got 70% of your votes in on election night. And our primary, 25% voted in person, so we had 25% in on election night, and it took us a week to count the others. So we're going to have all the in-person votes in on election night, but we're also doing this. The governor and I required that the counties process and tabulate all their absentee ballots on election night if they've received them. There will be some absentee ballots that won't have arrived on election night. We're giving them a few more days to arrive if they're timely cast before election day. In other words, if they're mailed on or before election day. But I think we'll have mostly absentee in too. So between those two, we're going to have 80% of the vote, 85% of the vote in election night and reported to the public. So we've got finality for the candidates and of course for the electorate. So I think we're going to have a much better election process than other states have had. I'm really proud to be a rookie, new to town, but to have such a successful election under my belt already for the primary. And so far, election's going very smoothly for the general. As I said, we had 658,000 absentee ballots requested. That's a drop of about 200,000 from the primary. That's about the sweet spot of what our county clerks can manage administratively. And then early voting has gone really well. On our first day, we had about 60,000 Kentucky voters vote. I don't have numbers yet for yesterday. I'll have more comprehensive numbers soon. But in any event, Kentuckians are showing up to vote, and every voter that shows up today, or yesterday or tomorrow to vote is another one that won't be in line on November 3rd. So I'm really proud of how well it's going. And with that, I'll take any questions or feedback. Thank you all.
Secretary Adams, I just want to let you know you've gotten a lot of compliments in the chat, people thanking you for your service, and really, you make it look so easy, but we know you've had to reimagine, and just you've spent so much time on all the details, and that's why it is so smooth. So thank you for all you've done to help make it accessible for everyone across the state to be able to vote, no matter what their situation is. It means a great deal, and also your manner of being bipartisan in your approach and working with the governor, it means a lot to Kentucky to see that. So thank you for that. We've got several questions, if that's okay. I'll just go ahead and ask some of them. You might see some of them on your screen as well. One of the ones that folks want to know is with this absentee ballot, can you drop it off at any voting place, or are there just certain places you can drop that off if you decide to do it instead of mail it?
Well, I'll be honest, I don't have memorized all the different drop box locations around the state. Those weren't things that I had to approve on the county's parts. But my understanding is that in Jefferson County, the drop-off locations are the county clerk's office at West Ormsby, and also each of the 4 early voting locations.
Okay.
Which is, well, I think you all have those already, but it's the 4 early voting locations.
Yes.
The African American Heritage Center, the Yum Center, the Louisville Marriott East, and the Fair and Expo Center.
Yes, Larry shares that there was one at the Marriott where he was yesterday, so very good. They still want to know a little bit more about, will our voting information be at all available polling places so that we can go to any of the polling places, or do you have to go to one within your geographic area?
Well, the answer varies by county, on the understanding that we're just talking about Jefferson County. They're all vote centers. A vote center is something I proposed before the pandemic in my Easy to Vote bill in the legislature. So a vote center basically is you don't have to vote at a particular precinct. You can vote anywhere in the county. Every county or every location can handle any voter in the county. Here's why that's important. It's really important in a pandemic because we've had to close a lot of the precincts. Nursing homes frequently are precinct voting locations. Obviously, we can't do that this year. We've had to close a lot of typical locations. They're not able to handle social distancing or their insurance won't cover it or what have you. So that's confusing to voters. They got to know where to go. We made that easy by letting them go anywhere. They can go to the Yum Center, they can go to the Louisville Marriott East or Ballard High School or wherever it is they want to go vote, whatever's convenient for them. And the reason we're able to do that is through technology. It used to be that if I voted at Ballard High School and I went downtown to vote at the Yum Center, they would not figure that out until after they audited the election and went through the books. By us using e-poll books to sign people in, we know in real time electronically if someone's voted or not. If you voted absentee or in person, either way, we know that in real time. And that information is available to every other poll worker in the county immediately. That helps us prevent double voting. But more important, it makes it easier for the voter. Let's say I don't work in downtown Louisville anymore. I work in Frankfort, but I used to work in downtown Louisville. It would have been way easier for me to vote at the Yum Center than to go back and get home in time to vote at my precinct. So it actually works out better for the voters to have the flexibility to go to any one of numbers of locations. So I'd like to see us maybe not require vote centers, but at least make them permissive for the counties, because they actually require fewer poll workers to traffic the same number of voters through, which helps address the crisis we have. It makes it easier for the voter. I can't tell you how many voters I've seen disenfranchised over the years because they went to the wrong precinct. They didn't know better. And they just gave up.
Yeah.
And it's also very efficient in terms of cost to have fewer locations that can process more voters. So I'd like to see us move that way in a permanent fashion, but that would take legislation.
Right. Okay. There was a little confusion here in Louisville. I guess if you're in line when the polls are supposed to close, do you go ahead and honor, even though it's past the time, whoever is in line to be able to go ahead and vote, or how does that work?
If you're in line so we're talking about obviously election day itself. If you're in line at 6 p.m. on election day, by law, you're permitted to vote. You're considered as being there at 6 o'clock if you're in line at 6 o'clock, even if it's 7 o'clock.
Okay.
Fortunately, we didn't really have a lot of problems with that in the primary. But in some states, they've had problems this year. They've had people in line until after midnight even waiting to vote. We haven't had any experiences like that. I think it's because we've made so much early voting available to take some of the pressure off.
Yes, for sure. This question comes from Alice Bridges, and she asks, Governor Beshear's executive order reinstated voting rights to many people with past felonies who have completed their sentences, yet she understands there is no government coordinated effort to alert the people that they can vote again. Do you envision addressing that communication challenge to re-enfranchise these citizens? And she also says, thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm not going to say anything critical here, but I'll answer your question frankly. I've not been included in anything that the governor does with respect to that program. I actually approached the governor's chief of staff the business day before I was sworn in as Secretary of State and asked to be a partner on this to help market this information to impacted citizens. And I was told, thanks for stopping by, but this was going to be the governor's project and he was going to do it his way. So he really hasn't included me. He's got his own website. In fact, he held a press conference when he announced this and didn't invite me, the chief election official. He just invited Democrats. So again, look, he's the boss. He's the chief executive. It's his executive order. He can do it as he likes it. But the reason there's not a coordinated government effort is because I'm being kept out of it.
Okay, thank you for the answer. This is from Dan Hartledge, and he asked, the president is calling for an army of poll watchers to go to the polling locations. How will Kentucky handle a scenario where an army of people enter the polling locations to monitor the workers and voters?
Under Kentucky law, it's very clear who is and who is not allowed in a voting location. We've had media requests to come in, and we've said, well, thanks, we appreciate it, but y'all can stand outside. That's the law. And we're doing that with everybody. Here are the following people that are allowed to be in a voting location. Number one, the voters. Number two, the election officials. Number three, challengers that are appointed by the political parties. Democrats are allowed to appoint X number of people and Republicans are allowed to appoint X number of people. Usually they're the same people every cycle. They're not allowed to challenge you while you're voting. They're not allowed to really interact with you at all as a voter. But if they see someone that they know isn't eligible to vote, they're allowed to approach election officials and file a complaint. Those are the only people that are allowed. And the people who are the challengers have to be approved by the respective parties. So I don't envision a scenario where you're going to have vigilante type people showing up in the polling locations because they won't be on these approved lists. The parties know better than to let people like that be their appointed challengers. So those are the only people that are allowed in. If anyone else tries to muscle their way in, they'll be removed.
Very good. Thank you. You kind of touched on this during your remarks, but I'll go ahead and make sure we're clear on this one. It's from Rick Harned, and he asked, do you expect weekend voting to be available in the future, and also the non-business hours voting?
Well, not really. I'll tell you why. Everything that we've done this year that's new and I think better has been done via emergency powers that I was granted. The governor and I were both granted by the legislature to be able to handle voting safely in a pandemic. But those are not permanent changes. I'm just using emergency authority, and once this election's over, I turn back into a pumpkin. I don't have any permanent authority to implement any changes. I just turn back into a bureaucrat essentially. So those things are up to the legislature. I'll be candid, I don't really see them making it easy to vote on a permanent basis. I'm going to try. But I actually have had pretty strained relationships with the legislature since I've made it easier to vote. My office has been largely defunded. I'm not actually using your tax dollars. I'm living off a savings account left by corporate fee payments in the past. And I'm not even really on good speaking terms, unfortunately, with a lot of the leadership. So if they're angry at me for making it safe to vote in a pandemic, I'm not really optimistic about permanent changes.
Yeah, okay. In closing, I just want to thank you so much for being with us. Most of the comments are just thanking you and commenting that they've been by, and just appreciating you're making it more ways to vote, so it's not so difficult for people to get there. And so I just want to thank you so very much on behalf of the club for your service and for all you're doing to make voting possible for Kentuckians, especially during this pandemic. So thank you, Secretary.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you all. As we close the meeting, I do want to mention a couple of things as reminders. Each of you were emailed a member survey. We want to hear from you, so your input will help inform our decisions for the club. And a reminder again that next week we will begin early at 11:45 with Dr. Michael Clark, who's the Director of Center for Business and Economic Research at UK. I think you'll really enjoy his presentation. It's very data-driven and he does an excellent job. And Leader Mitch McConnell plans to be with us from DC immediately following at 12:30, his schedule permitting, but he is very helpful to be with us. Immediately following this meeting, we have our What is Rotary session, and those that are interested in membership, we hope that you'll stay on the line. And I thank everyone for being here with us today. We're adjourned.